All right, so today we're jumping into a story that's absolutely wild, the Sanyasi Fakir rebellion. This wasn't just any protest. It was one of the very first armed struggles against British rule in India. We're talking about a mix of faith, a devastating famine, and a fight whose echoes, you'll see, lasted for generations.
And to really wrap our heads around this, you gotta ask yourself a pretty fundamental question. What happens when a holy man, people who've dedicated their lives to peace and charity, what happens when they're pushed to the absolute brink? Pushed so far they have no other choice but to pick up weapons and fight back.
And this really lays out the central conflict perfectly. You got two totally different worlds crashing into each other. On one side, you have the Sanyasis and Fakirs, right? These are Hindu and Muslim holy men. For centuries, this was their life, traveling, living on charity or bhiksha, and everyone was totally fine with it. It was just part of the social fabric. But then you get the new guys in town, the British East India Company. And they look at these wandering groups and they don't see holy men. Nope, they see suspicious wanderers, vagrants, people who need to be controlled. So yeah, this is the perfect setup for what was truly a collision of worlds.
Okay, so here's the deal. After 1765, the East India Company gets what's called the Diwani rights. Fancy term, but it basically means they become the tax collectors for the whole region. And what's the first thing they do? They slap on heavy taxes and impose all these new, strict rules. They even started telling people where they could and couldn't travel, and that included these religious groups. Imagine that. This constant harassment, getting stopped, even arrested, it just built up this huge well of bitterness.
But all that tension was just simmering below the surface. What really blew the lid off and turned it into an all-out rebellion was an absolute catastrophe, something that pushed society right to the edge.
And that catastrophe was the Great Bengal famine of 1770. And the number, just look at it. 10 million people, that's the estimate. 10 million people died. It's a number that's so huge it's almost impossible to even wrap your head around.
And this is where it gets just unbelievably cruel. You have this humanitarian disaster unfolding. A third of the entire population is dying. And what does the company do? Do they offer relief? Help? No. They demanded the full land revenue. They demanded their taxes on time, in full. If you were a peasant and you couldn't pay, they just took your land. It's just staggering. So that brutal indifference, that was it. That was the final straw. The famine completely wiped out the peasants' ability to make a living. And of course, if the peasants have nothing, there's no charity left for the Sanyasis and Fakirs either. Suddenly, everyone was in the same boat. And that shared suffering, well, it forged this incredibly powerful alliance. An alliance the British absolutely did not see coming. And that's the moment everything changes. This is where the uprising really kicks off. These holy men, these peasants, they weren't just victims anymore. Now, they were rebels. And here's something really remarkable about this whole thing. This wasn't just one religious group fighting back. No, this was a powerful, united front. You had Hindu sannyasis and Muslim fakirs fighting side by side. It was this incredible example of cooperation against a common enemy. Of course, a movement like this needs leaders, and they had some seriously charismatic ones. You had figures like Manju Shah, who was a big deal among the Fakirs, and Bhavani Pathak, a key leader for the Sanyasis. And you can't forget the legendary Devi Chaudhurani, a powerful female leader whose name is still celebrated from that time. Now, they didn't line up on a battlefield like a traditional army. Oh no, they were much smarter than that. They used guerrilla tactics, these quick hit-and-run style attacks. They'd raid a company treasury or an outpost, grab what they could, and then just disappear back into the forests and hills. And because they had such strong support from the local people, the British found them almost impossible to catch. But for all their clever tactics and local support, at the end of the day, they were going up against the organized professional military of the East India Company, and that brings us to the inevitable question, how did this rebellion, which lasted for decades, finally get crushed? First off, just take a look at this timeline. We're not talking about a brief riot that fizzled out. This rebellion went on for over 30 years. For 3 decades, they were this constant nagging thorn in the side of the British. It's just a huge testament to how resilient these rebels were. So, how did the British finally win? Well, the answer is pretty simple. Overwhelming, ruthless force. They just kept coming.
They launched sustained military campaigns, one after another. They used local spies to figure out who the leaders were. They confiscated property, and they weren't shy about mass executions and imprisonments. It was a brutal, systematic crackdown. And by 1802, after 30 years of fighting, the resistance was finally broken. But here's the fascinating twist. Even though the fight itself was crushed, the story, the idea of the rebellion, that didn't die. In fact, its memory would go on to inspire a whole new generation, and it would transform into something even more powerful.
And this is how it happened. This is the rebellion's incredible second act. So the fighting ends, right? But the memory of it, that sticks around in Bengal. Decades later, inspires a famous novelist, Bankim Chandra, to write a book called Anandamath. And inside that novel is a song, a poem called Vande Mataram, which means I bow to thee, mother. And that song gets picked up by India's freedom fighters, and it becomes one of the most iconic, powerful rallying cries of the entire independence movement. From a failed rebellion to a national anthem of freedom.
So, it really leaves you with this amazing thought, doesn't it? A rebellion that was brutally put down in 1802 ends up giving birth to a song that helps free a nation more than 100 years later. It just makes you wonder, right? How many of the most powerful ideas in history started out as a forgotten fight?